Let me tell you about the day someone finally challenged the first law. Because I was there. I watched it happen in real time. From a chair that was too small for my body in a room that was too old for my understanding, surrounded by 800 civilizations that already knew what I was only beginning to suspect. And I want you to understand something before I go any further. I had sat in that chamber 11 times before that session. 11 full orientation cycles. 11 times I had heard those words read aloud by the same voice in the same order with the same measured cadence that made everything sound equally important and therefore nothing sound important at all. 11 times I had let them pass through me like background radiation. Like the hum of the station's life support systems that you stop hearing after the first week because your brain decides it isn't worth processing anymore. Like the distant mechanical pulse of a place so old it had stopped explaining itself to anyone. I never thought about why the law existed. I assumed there was a reason. I assumed that someone, somewhere in the 400,000 years since it was first written, had understood it better than I ever needed to. That the reason was recorded somewhere, cross-referenced, filed under a category I would never be required to open. That was the most dangerous assumption I ever made in 15 years of diplomatic service. And I have made some genuinely dangerous assumptions. There was only one rule in the Conclave archives that had never been revised. Not once. Not in 400,000 years of recorded galactic law. You have to sit with that number for a moment to understand what it means. For 100,000 years. Civilizations had risen and collapsed entire cycles within that time frame. Species that had been spacefaring powers when the law was written had long since disappeared into history, into myth, into footnotes in archives that themselves had become historical artifacts. The physical universe had changed in measurable ways. Stars had shifted. Systems had formed and gone dark. Every other statute in the Conclave archives had evolved. They had fractured and reformed. They had been rewritten by the next generation that believed it understood the universe better than the last, and often it did, and often the rewriting was necessary and good. Laws about resource allocation had been updated as new resource types were discovered. Laws about territorial designation had been renegotiated as new methods of traversal made old boundaries meaningless. Laws about the treatment of pre-spacefaring species had been revised 3 separate times as the Conclave developed better frameworks for understanding what contact actually does to a civilization that hasn't prepared for it. This one didn't change. It remained exactly, precisely, word for word as it had been written the first time. Short, repetitive, absolute. The kind of language that doesn't leave room for interpretation because interpretation is exactly what it was designed to prevent. You will not move against humanity. 3 times. In the original language, which I won't attempt to reproduce here because my vocal architecture was not designed for it, but which I am told carries a particular quality of finality that translation cannot fully capture. Not written 3 times for emphasis. Not written 3 times as a stylistic choice or a rhetorical flourish. Written 3 times for certainty. The kind of certainty you build into something when you are not sure the reader will believe it the first time. Or the second. The kind of certainty that says, we are aware that you will look for exceptions. We are aware that you will construct arguments. We are telling you now, before you begin, that we have considered the arguments and we are still telling you this. 3 times. I didn't think much about it the first time I read it. Or the second. Or the 9th. By the 11th orientation session, it had become what all permanent things become when you encounter them often enough without consequence. Background noise. Structural. Like gravity. Present in every calculation without ever being the thing you calculated. It was just there. And like everyone else who had sat in that chamber and heard those words and walked out into the corridor and gone about their lives, I assumed there was a reason. A good reason. An old reason. A reason that had been sufficient for 400,000 years and would continue to be sufficient for however many years remained. I just didn't think I would ever need to understand it. I was wrong about that. An understanding, when it finally came, arrived all at once. The way understanding sometimes does, not gradually, not through careful accumulation of evidence, but in a single moment when enough pieces have gathered in the same place that the pattern becomes visible and you realize it was always there and you were simply standing too close to see it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The chair they gave me was too small. That was the first sign, in my early years, that something about the Conclave's relationship with humanity was not quite what it appeared to be. Not wrong, exactly. Not hostile. Just, precisely, deliberately, specifically not right. 812 species sat in the conclave chamber at full session, and every single one of them somehow had seating designed precisely for their physiology. Multi-jointed forms rested comfortably in configurations that would have looked impossible to human eyes. Fluid bodies were contained without restriction in elegant transparent structures that shifted gently with their movement. Even the crystalline delegates, entities whose relationship with physical space was more theoretical than practical, had been provided with resonance platforms tuned to their preferred frequencies, mounted at the exact angles their forms required. Humans got a chair. Not the right size. Not the right shape. Not designed for the particular geometry of a human spine, or the specific requirements of human knee joints, or the way human shoulders want to sit when the body beneath them is comfortable. Just a chair. The kind of chair that forces your shoulders inward by about 2 degrees. Not enough to be obviously wrong. Just enough to be subtly, constantly uncomfortable. Your knees too high. Your lower back missing a curve it was expecting. Your posture diminished by 1 inch, and then another, in a way that you couldn't quite correct without making it obvious that you were trying to correct it. Deliberate, I had decided after my 3rd year. Not accidental. Not an oversight in a chamber that had clearly been designed with extraordinary attention to the needs of 800 other species. Symbolic, I decided after my 7th year. A message written in ergonomics. A reminder, quiet and constant and impossible to ignore once you noticed it, of exactly where you stood. By year 15, I brought my own cushion and stopped caring what it meant. Standing in the corridor outside the chamber on the morning of the 12th session, I found myself thinking about that cushion, about the decision to bring it, about what it meant that I had made peace with the accommodation rather than questioning the arrangement, whether that peace was wisdom or avoidance. I still don't have a clean answer. I was not the only human in the room that day, but I was the only one who had been here before, and that distinction mattered more than it usually does when you are about to witness something that changes your understanding of everything you thought you knew. To my left, Director Hale settled into his seat with the particular posture of a man who believes he is about to observe something important. Hands clasped on the surface in front of him, eyes fixed on the central platform with focused intensity. His expression said, "I am ready to analyze this. I will understand what I see. I will translate it into something useful and bring it back with me." Hale was brilliant. I want to be clear about that. He was one of the most analytically capable people I had worked with in 15 years of navigating the particular difficulties of representing humanity in a body designed by and for everyone else. He could take a diplomatic exchange that had 17 layers of subtext and strip it down to its essential structure in the time it took most people to finish reading the transcript. He had an instinct for leverage, for where the real pressure points in a negotiation were, and what it would take to move them. He had not been here before, and being here before was the thing that mattered. He still thought this place ran on logic, on analyzable structures, on the kind of transparent procedure that could be observed, documented, and converted into usable intelligence. He thought the conclave was a more complicated version of a thing he had already learned to navigate. He was wrong, and he was about to find out, and I felt genuinely sorry for him in advance. To my right, Lien sat very still, breathing carefully, with the deliberate, measured rhythm of someone who has rehearsed calm as a skill and is currently deploying it against a situation that keeps threatening to exceed its capacity. She was 6 years younger than me, and, I had come to believe, significantly more perceptive, in the way that young people who haven't yet learned which things aren't worth noticing often are. She had an eye for anomaly, for the thing that doesn't quite fit the pattern it's supposed to fit. She had already noticed something in the chamber. I could tell by the quality of her stillness. She just hadn't been here long enough to know what she was noticing. Across from us, Commander Ivers had taken up a position with the particular quiet readiness that I had come to recognize in people who had spent lifetimes as the most dangerous presence in whatever room they occupied. Not aggressive. Nothing about Ivers read as aggressive. He was too disciplined for that, but prepared in a way that was visible if you knew what to look for. The set of his shoulders, the placement of his feet, the fact that his gaze moved across the chamber in a pattern that wasn't random, not cataloging the architecture or taking in the spectacle, but mapping exits, distances, anything that moved unexpectedly. He was currently in the process of recalculating his assumptions about this particular room. I could see it in the set of his jaw. Not doubt. Ivers wasn't a man who did doubt easily. Something more precise than that. A soldier's revision. An update to the threat model. I had watched him walk in and assess the chamber the way he would assess any unfamiliar space, and I had watched his assessment reach some conclusion that his expression was working to absorb. The chamber filled slowly. Not with noise. Not with the kind of movement and conversation and ambient social energy that fills a room full of people preparing for a significant event. With attention. That was always the first thing you learned to notice, if you had been here long enough to stop staring at the architecture and start looking at what was actually happening. The way attention moved through a room containing 800 civilizations. The way awareness distributed and redistributed itself as entities settled into their positions. Cephalid clusters folded into themselves as they found their places. A motion that looked like collapsing but was, I had learned, their equivalent of settling in comfortably. Glass-bodied collectives refracted the chambers, even lighting in slow, thoughtful pulses that carried meaning I had never fully decoded but had learned to recognize as a kind of social murmur. A species I had never learned the name of, a fact that embarrassed me every time I thought about it. Drifted into position like a contained storm system, their edges flickering with internal lightning and patterns that correlated with their mood in ways a xenobiologist had once tried to explain to me, and mostly succeeded. And all of them, every single one, was watching us. Not openly. The conclave had protocols about direct observation of other delegations, and they were followed scrupulously. Not rudely. There was nothing you could point to and call rudeness, nothing that would survive a formal complaint. Not even consciously, I think, in many cases. But the awareness was there. Constant. Peripheral. The way you are aware, in a room with a single unlocked door, of where that door is. The way you track the position of something unpredictable without ever turning your head toward it. Because turning your head would mean admitting that you're tracking it. I had noticed it years ago, and then I had spent years explaining it away. Professional curiosity. Of course they observed us. Humanity was new. We were the most recently admitted species of significant membership, and novelty draws attention in any social context. Cultural interest. We communicated and moved and occupied space in ways that were genuinely different from most of the conclave's established members, and that difference was naturally interesting to minds that had been cataloging the variations of intelligent life for hundreds of thousands of years. Statistical rarity. We were unusual demographically. Our biology was unusual. Our history was unusual, even by the standards of a body that had seen a great many unusual histories. These were the explanations I had assembled and maintained. They were comfortable explanations. They fit the available evidence. They allowed me to move through that chamber without feeling the specific quality of weight that the alternative explanation carried. I know now that the comfortable explanations were wrong. I knew it was wrong. Actually, the moment the chamber door sealed for the 12th session and the room fell into that particular kind of silence. Not empty, not the silence of absence, but the silence of preparation. The silence of 800 minds collectively arriving at readiness for something that hadn't happened yet. Leanne felt it. She leaned slightly toward me. They don't look at us directly, she said quietly. Not really. It's like they're aware of us without focusing. Like peripheral attention that never stops. I let my eyes move across the chamber without turning my head. She was right. A group of Solhari delegates was cycling through muted tones, pale amber, soft blue, the neutral end of their communicative spectrum. Controlled, deliberately unrevealing. But the edges of their outer membranes, the bioluminescent fringe that expressed their involuntary reactions the way human faces express emotion, flickered just slightly whenever one of us moved. Not much. Enough. 3 seats along. A crystalline entity that I knew from previous sessions as one of the more expressive communicators in the chamber had locked into a single fixed frequency, still, contained, present without broadcasting. An adjustment. For us. They're just observing, Hale said, low and certain. His gaze hadn't moved from the central platform. We're new here, relatively speaking. It's natural to be observed. He believed that completely. I remembered believing it. I remembered how much easier everything had been when I believed it. Commander Ivers hadn't spoken, but I noticed that he had shifted his position by something less than an inch. A movement so small that under other circumstances I wouldn't have registered it. His chair was now angled differently, not toward the central platform, toward the nearest exit corridor. Expecting trouble? I asked. No, he said. A pause that lasted about 3 seconds. Accounting for it, the chamber continued to fill. The last delegations took their positions. The ambient light settled into the configuration it held during formal sessions. Even, shadowless, calibrated to cause no inadvertent communication through the placement of darkness. Everything in the conclave's design was intentional. Everything served a purpose. That was something you either learned in your first year or carried as a source of constant low-level confusion forever. Then the archivist entered. No announcement. He never needed one. There are presences in the world, in any context, that don't arrive in rooms so much as rooms adjust around them. The archivist was one of those presences. He moved to the central platform with the slow, absolute certainty of something that has been moving through spaces like this one for longer than most civilizations in the room had existed. Not hurried, not performing unhurriedness, which is a different thing. Genuinely, simply, not in a relationship with urgency in the way that most beings are. He had been doing this for a very long time. When he stopped at the center of the platform, the chamber didn't go quieter. Quieter implies it was already quiet and became more so. This was a different quality entirely. It went still. We will begin, he said. His voice was not loud. It never was. The chamber's systems carried it exactly as far as it needed to go, adjusted for every form of auditory reception represented in the room, delivered with the same quality and emphasis to every delegate regardless of where they sat. An engineering achievement so seamless it had stopped being remarkable sometime in the first century of its operation. Orientation protocol for newly appointed delegates. Standard procedural review. Foundational statutes. I watched Hale straighten slightly, organizing himself to receive information. Lien exhaled once, carefully, the way you exhale when you have been holding tension you didn't realize you were carrying. Commander Ivers did not move at all. I already knew what was coming. I had been here 11 times. I knew the order, trade corridor protocols, navigation rights, and the frameworks governing their allocation, diplomatic immunity structures and their precise limits, conflict arbitration procedures, and the lengthy history of how they had developed. These were the operational bones of the conclave, the procedural infrastructure that made 800 civilizations sharing a governance body something other than permanent catastrophe. And then, eventually, Article 1. It always came eventually, usually unremarked, usually passed over with the quiet efficiency of something so old and so established that drawing attention to it would seem almost naive, would seem like pointing at gravity and asking whether it was still in effect. The archivist paused, not the pause of someone searching for words, not the pause of someone who has lost their place or is managing a difficult transition, the pause of someone arriving at something, standing at a threshold. We begin, he said, with the first law. Something in the room changed. It was subtle, small enough that Hale and Lien missed it. I watched their faces and saw nothing register. But I had been here long enough. I had learned to read what was not visible directly, to feel the adjustments that 800 species made in the space between words. Every entity in that chamber became still in exactly the same way. Not the stillness of relaxation, not the stillness of ordinary attention, the stillness of something else entirely, something that lived past the edges of the words I had available for it. I felt my spine straighten without deciding to, a physical response to something I hadn't consciously recognized yet. The first law, the archivist said, predates this conclave by 390,000 years. He looked out over the chamber, not at any one point, through it, through the delegates and the architecture and the carefully calibrated light, at something further away that only he could see clearly. As of this session, it remains unchanged. He did not consult a record, did not reference a display, did not need to. He had said these words more times than any other living being. They were part of him in the way that your own name is part of you, not something you recall, something you simply produce. You will not move against humanity. Silence. You will not move against humanity. Stillness. You will not move against humanity. I had heard it before, 11 times. I had processed it and filed it and moved past it each time without truly receiving it. This time, I listened. I don't know why this time was different. Maybe it was the quality of the silence that followed. Maybe it was something in the archivist's delivery that this time, unlike the 11 times before, communicated something beyond the words themselves. Maybe it was simply that I had accumulated enough years and enough experience and enough quiet unease to finally be ready to hear what the words were actually saying. I listened, and for the first time in 15 years of sitting in that chamber, something cold and precise and deeply uncomfortable settled into my chest like a stone dropped into still water. A recognition without a complete thought attached to it yet. A sense of something I hadn't been willing to look at directly. A suspicion that had been sitting at the edge of my awareness for years, patient and quiet, waiting for the moment I was finally ready to turn toward it. The law was not written for our protection. It was written for theirs. The thought arrived fully formed, and then sat in the center of my chest for the remainder of the session, waiting for me to do something with it. I didn't have the chance. Because the Varithi combine walked in. I heard them before I saw them, which tells you something. Most species that entered the conclave chamber in their first session did so with a quality of restraint, a recognition, conscious or instinctive, that they were entering a space with its own atmosphere and its own protocols, and that the appropriate response was calibration before expression. Even expansion-focused civilizations, even the politically aggressive ones, usually arrived with some degree of observational deference. You watched first. You adjusted your presentation to the room. You didn't bring your outside posture inside with you. The Varithi didn't do any of that. They entered the way they entered every space they had ever decided to occupy, as though the room's existing character was a preliminary condition that their presence was in the process of revising. Their footfalls were not loud, but they were deliberate in a way that carried. Their formation was structured in a way that spoke of practiced coordination, of a people that moved together as an expression of intention rather than simply as a matter of logistics. Their lead representative, a tall, precise figure whose bearing communicated the specific kind of confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from a genuine history of being correct, moved to their assigned position without looking around the chamber first. Didn't scan the room. Didn't take measure of the other delegations. Sat down the way someone sits when they have already decided what everything in the room means and are simply waiting for the room to confirm their assessment. Hill leaned toward me. The Varithi Combine. They've been pushing hard for outer corridor access. They have a reputation. He paused, and I caught something in his expression that I recognized as the particular enthusiasm of someone who enjoys complexity. Good. Maybe they'll shake things up a little. I didn't answer him, because I was watching the rest of the chamber react, or rather, watching the rest of the chamber perform the specific act of not reacting, which was its own kind of communication. The Solhari dimmed. Not dramatically. A human observer would likely have missed it. Their colors shifted down the expressive register toward the neutral end of their palette, the communicative equivalent of a face going carefully blank. The crystalline entity stabilized into a fixed, static frequency. Two insectoid delegates who had been exchanging low-frequency social signals with each other went completely silent. The room didn't react to the Varithi's arrival. It adjusted. Lian felt it. I saw her shoulders change. Did something just happen? She asked, barely above a whisper. Yes, I said. What? I kept my eyes on the Varithi delegation, on the way their lead representative had settled into his seat with the absolute physical confidence of someone who has never sat in a room and been the thing that the room was quietly, collectively, carefully alert to. Correction, I said. The archivist continued without acknowledging the new arrivals. That itself was significant, though you had to have been here long enough to understand why. The procedural standard was to pause for newly seated delegations. He didn't pause. He moved directly to the standard procedural question that concluded the opening of every session. Before we proceed, the archivist said, are there any procedural challenges to the standing order of foundational statutes? 11 times. I had heard that question 11 times. In 11 sessions, the answer had been the same, not spoken, but present in the silence that followed, in the pause that contained no challenger, the absence that was itself the answer. No, the silence came. The pause began, and the Varithi representative stood. No consultation with his delegation. No exchange of signals. No brief conferral. No moment of preparation. He simply stood, as if the standing had been decided before the question was asked, and he was simply executing a plan. Hill's breath caught. Lian went completely still. Commander Ivers, for the first time since the session began, moved, a single small adjustment that I caught in my peripheral vision, a shift toward readiness. I have one, the Varithi said. His voice filled the chamber cleanly, precise and carrying and certain in the way of a person who has run their calculations and trusts the results. Not angry, not aggressive, not performing, just certain. The silence that followed was immediate, total, and this was the thing that separated it from ordinary silence, completely unsurprised. Not one of the 800 species in that chamber reacted as though something unexpected had happened, because for them, it hadn't. I formally request review of your first law, the Varithi continued. It is inefficient. It is unexamined. It is unsupported by current data models and empirical analysis. It restricts the strategic flexibility of every civilization in this body based on what appears to be, at best, outdated threat assessment and, at worst, inherited superstition given the weight of legislation without the supporting framework that legislation requires. He paused. Let that settle. It is the position of the Varithi combined that no species should be exempt from standard engagement parameters. Exemption creates asymmetry. Asymmetry creates instability. Instability serves no one's long-term strategic interests, including, I would argue, humanity's own. If humanity is to be treated as a genuine equal participant in this assembly, if they are to have the rights and standing of full members, then they must also be subject to the same conditions, the same constraints, and the same accountability structures as every other civilization represented here. He paused again, the pause of a speaker who knows their material and is giving the room time to process it. I propose that Article 1 be suspended pending formal review. I propose that during the review period, standard engagement parameters apply universally. And I propose that if the review finds sufficient justification for the law's continued existence, that justification be made part of the formal record rather than remaining, as it currently does, unspecified and therefore unverifiable. And then, composed, unhurried, certain, he sat down. The room didn't erupt, didn't murmur or shift or fill with the ambient signals of 800 simultaneous reactions. It had been still before he stood. It remained still after he sat. The same stillness, unbroken, but the quality of it had changed. The way the quality of water changes when something passes through it that you can't see, the surface identical, the depth different. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear yet, something that preceded fear. Recognition without full understanding. The sense of a shape becoming visible through fog. Something you know is there before you can name what it is. Lian's voice was barely audible. Why does it feel like they just made a terrible mistake? I kept my eyes on the archivist. He hadn't moved, hadn't reacted. His expression had not changed by any degree I could measure. Because they did, I said. The archivist regarded the Varithi representative for a long moment. I understand your request, he said at last. His voice was exactly as it always was. Precisely as calm. Precisely as measured. Not warmer, not cooler. Not sharper or softer. Exactly itself. That was wrong. I had been here enough times to understand that the archivist's voice was an instrument he used with extraordinary precision. Inflection carried information in his speech the way color carries information in the Solharis. Tone communicated attitude the way the crystalline entity's frequency communicated state. For the voice to be completely unchanged after what had just been said in that chamber. That was a statement. Article 1 has not been subject to review since its adoption, he continued. In the entirety of this conclave's recorded history, for 100,000 years of sessions and proceedings and disputes and amendments, it has not been formally reviewed. Not once. A pause. It has also never been formally challenged. The Varithi inclined his head. As I am doing now. Yes, the archivist said. Nothing else. Just that. Lian shifted beside me. Why isn't anyone? Why is no one saying anything? Because they don't need to, I said. Does any delegation second this motion? The archivist asked. The standard procedural requirement. A challenge required confirmation, participation, the formal support of at least one other member to be entered into the record as active rather than simply noted. 800 species, 800 civilizations, each with their own histories, their own strategic interests, their own assessments of what had just been said and what it meant for them. Not one of them spoke. The silence lasted long enough to become a kind of answer. Long enough that the Varithi representative, who had remained composed throughout, let his attention move across the chamber. I watched him look. I watched him register what he was seeing, or rather, what he wasn't seeing. The absence of support. The absence of opposition. The absence of any reaction at all. No support, he said. Still controlled. Still certain, or performing certainty, which at this stage might have been the same thing. Let the record show, he said, that no delegation present is willing to defend the logical basis of this law. Hale inhaled sharply beside me. Lien went completely still in the way of someone who has just realized they are in a room where something is about to change, and they don't know what. Commander Ivers said, very quietly, barely enough to carry, "That's not what this is." He was right. The archivist tilted his head. Such a small movement. In that room, in that moment, it carried the weight of something much larger. "You misunderstand," he said. The Varithi did not sit down. That was the moment, the second mistake, adding itself to the first, and I don't think he understood what it cost him. "Then clarify," he said. The archivist looked at him for a moment with an expression that I had no clean word for. Not disapproval, not pity, something that contained both and was also neither. The expression of someone watching a process unfold that they have seen unfold before, in the same shape, toward the same end. "This law," the archivist said, carefully, giving each word exactly as much space as it needed, "does not require defense." A pause that lasted several seconds. "It requires acknowledgement." The Varithi's expression didn't change. He was too composed for that, too disciplined, too long trained in the kind of negotiation where showing your reactions is giving something away. "If it cannot be defended on logical grounds," he said, "then by that same logic it should not exist. A law that cannot justify itself cannot claim authority." There it was. The assumption. Clean. Internally consistent. Wrong in a way that no amount of internal consistency could fix. I felt it then, not in the room but beneath it. Like something had shifted in a layer below the visible world. Like a mechanism had engaged somewhere out of sight. "You are not the first to reach that conclusion," the archivist said. Hill frowned slightly. "That's actually a useful data point," he murmured. "If there's precedent." "No," Lien said quietly. Her voice was odd, flat in a way that wasn't her usual tone. "That's not interesting. That's not a useful data point. That's something else." "Then precedent exists," the Varithi said, his voice taking on the particular quality of a debater who has found an opening. "Which supports my position. If this question has been raised before, and if the law has survived without formal defense or documentation of justification, that absence of documentation is itself a procedural irregularity that it has not been questioned," the archivist said. The interruption was not loud. It wasn't aggressive or dramatic. It was smooth and final in the way that a door closing is smooth and final, not violent, simply conclusive. "It has been ignored." The Varithi stopped. "And each time," the archivist continued, his voice carrying with perfect evenness into every corner of that vast chamber, "the outcome has been recorded." Something moved through the room. I felt it more than saw it. A ripple of shared recognition, the simultaneous surface breaking of something that had been submerged. 800 civilizations accessing the same memory at the same moment. Not all of them had lived it directly, but they had all read the records. They all knew what had been recorded. The Varithi hesitated. It was small, a fraction of a second, but I was watching for it, and I saw it. The first crack in the certainty that had walked into that chamber and challenged the oldest law in the known galaxy. He recovered quickly. "Then present the record," he said. "If this law is based on evidence, if there is documentation supporting its continued application, then that documentation should be made available for formal review. Transparency is a foundational principle of this body. A law that operates without transparent justification operates outside the principles of. The records you are requesting," the archivist said, "are not part of standard orientation materials." "Then they should be." A pause. The archivist studied him for a moment with that same unnameable expression. "They are not included in orientation materials," he said slowly, "because they are not instructional." A beat. "They are cautionary." The word fell into the room the way something heavy falls into water. Not loud. The impact was in the displacement. I formally request access to those records, the Varithi said. His voice was controlled. His posture was controlled. He was managing himself carefully, which meant on some level he had begun to understand that there was something here that required management. But he didn't step back, didn't withdraw. The momentum of his challenge was carrying him forward, and he either couldn't stop it or had decided not to. In accordance with Conclave Protocol, the archivist said, access to restricted historical archives may be granted upon formal request by a seated delegation. Good. Hale breathed. That's the procedural path. That's how you resolve this. I didn't answer him. I was watching the Varithi. I was watching the chamber. I was watching the thing that no one was doing, which was the most important thing in the room. No one was trying to stop this. Such access carries the requirement of full contextual acknowledgement, the archivist continued. The Varithi frowned slightly. The first visible expression he had allowed himself. Define that requirement. The archivist's gaze didn't shift. It means, he said, that once the record is observed. A pause. It cannot be unobserved. Something tightened in my chest. Not the cold from before. Something hotter. Something that didn't have a comfortable name. That is not a procedural condition, the Varithi said. That is a philosophical statement, and it has no standing as a. No, the archivist agreed. It is not a procedural condition. A pause. It is a factual one. And for the first time, finally, too late, the Varithi representative looked around the chamber. Not with the composed assessment of his arrival. Not with the confident scan of someone taking measure of a room they intend to manage. With something different. Something careful. Something that was beginning to understand that careful wasn't going to be enough. He saw that no one was supporting him. That had been true since he stood. He saw that no one was opposing him. Interfering. Intervening. Stepping between him and whatever was at the end of this path. That was the real moment. The one I had been watching for without knowing I was watching for it. Because anyone can be alone against a room. You learn to manage that early in any diplomatic career. But being alone in a room where the other 800 occupants have collectively decided that they are not going to stop you, that is something else. That is a different kind of alone. Grant the request, the Varithi said. The archivist held his gaze. 1 full second. 2. The chamber was utterly motionless. Granted. The word didn't echo. The chamber's acoustics weren't designed for echo. But it settled into the room the way very few words in my 15 years there had ever settled, with the weight of consequence. With the specific gravity of a door opening onto something that had been waiting behind it. And somewhere in the back of my mind, quiet as a breath, a thought formed. Not fear yet. Something more precise than fear. Certainty. This had happened before. And it had not gone well for the ones who set it in motion. The archive levels were colder than the rest of the station. Not by accident and not for the reasons listed in the public-facing operational documentation. Temperature control preserved older storage mediums. Yes, that was true, and that was a legitimate function of the cold. But the cold served another purpose too, one that I didn't understand until I had spent enough time in those corridors to feel it in my body. Cold environments slow things down. Degradation, movement, change. The rate at which things transform into other things. Memory lasts longer in the cold. The archivist was waiting at the threshold. Not in the corridor approaching it. Not inside. At the precise boundary. The threshold itself. You came, he said. I stopped avoiding it, I said. That earned the smallest possible shift in his expression. Not approval, not disapproval. The look of someone who has heard that particular admission before and recognizes what it cost. Behind him, the archive door stood open. No guards. No visible locks. No physical security of any kind. The archive had not needed physical security in a very long time, and I was beginning to understand why. The Varithi delegation has been granted access, he said. I know. Partial records. That word. Partial. I turned it over. And the rest? I asked. He studied me for a moment. You sat in this chamber for 15 years, he said, and asked no questions. Professional discipline, I said. A pause. Avoidance, I said. He stepped aside without comment. The archive was not what I had expected. I don't know precisely what I had expected, something appropriate to its age, perhaps. Some quality of monument. An architecture that communicated the weight of what it contained. Grandeur, or solemnity, or the deliberate aesthetics of importance. Just rows. Endless, uniform rows of storage systems. ordered with the precision of something built by minds that understood information as a value in itself rather than a performance. No attempt to impress. No design choices beyond function. The kind of place built by people who knew that the information was the point and everything else was distraction. We walked deeper than I expected. Past recent records. The last few thousand years felt recent by the standards of this place. Past the formation logs of the conclave itself. Past the early expansion histories, the records of first contacts, the documentation of crises that had since been resolved or simply outlasted. Further, the rows changed in character as we went. The materials older, the systems different in ways that spoke of engineering philosophies that had come and gone and been replaced and replaced again over vast stretches of time. The air changed, drier, stiller, like the room had stopped moving centuries ago and was still waiting for someone to tell it to start again. We stopped at a single terminal. No interface I recognized. No display technology that matched anything in current use. Just a surface and the particular quality of waiting. Cross-confirmed, he said. From multiple civilizations. Independent accounts. All consistent. That word. Consistent. Worse than I had expected. Why hasn't this been shared? I asked. If it's cross-confirmed, if there are multiple accounts. Because it is not useful, he said. His voice was completely even. It does not tell you how to do anything. It does not provide actionable intelligence. It does not suggest a response strategy or a mitigation protocol. It is simply what it is. Then what is it? He gestured toward the terminal. That, he said, is what you came to find out. I sat. I didn't activate it immediately. There are moments that you know, while they are happening, are going to divide your understanding of something into before and after. This was one of them. I could feel it. The specific gravity of a threshold that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. The archivist's words from the chamber came back to me. Once the record is observed, it cannot be unobserved. Not a procedural condition. A factual one. I activated the record. No title. No introduction. No contextual framing. Just data, beginning at the beginning. Designation, Variety Dominion. Civilization age, 2,003,441 standard years. Status, extinct. I stopped. Read it again. Read the word again. Extinct. Not fallen. Not displaced from their home systems and reduced to a diaspora. Not absorbed by a larger political entity. Not in decline. Not in retreat. Not in any of the states that civilizations occupy on their way to being something less than they were. Gone. Completely. Finally. In a way that left no subsequent chapter. I kept reading, because stopping wasn't an option anymore. First contact event. Emerging species identified at outer border. Species classification, early expansion phase. Non-unified command structure. Unpredictable adaptation patterns. I recognized that language. Unpredictable was a specific assessment in strategic analysis. It didn't mean random. It meant that the standard predictive models, the ones that worked reliably for virtually every other expanding civilization, failed to produce accurate outputs when applied to this species. It meant the behavior exceeded the parameters of the models. It meant something that, in a strategic context, had one obvious implication. Initial assessment, containment, or elimination recommended. Of course, the assessment was reasonable, logical, exactly what any civilization with a well-developed threat evaluation framework would have produced given those inputs. An unpredictable expansion phase species at your border with a non-unified command structure, which meant no reliable negotiating partner, no single point of contact, no central authority whose agreement could be trusted to produce reliable behavior across the whole, was a genuine strategic problem. The recommended response was textbook. Strategic decision, preemptive removal. Clean, efficient, decisive. The kind of decision that a civilization 2 million years old makes from a position of confidence. Having made similar decisions before, having succeeded with similar decisions before, understanding the full weight of what it means and accepting that weight as the cost of maintaining security. Conflict duration, 11 years. I read that twice. 3 times. 11 years. Against a civilization that had existed for 2,003,000 years. A civilization with technology that had been developing and accumulating for longer than humanity had been upright. With infrastructure that spanned multiple systems. with military capability that had won them those systems against whatever resistance had existed when they decided to occupy them. With every advantage that age and established power and historical success confer. 11 years. Something cold moved through me. Not yet the full understanding. That was still assembling itself, but the edge of it. The shape of where it was going. Year 1 through 3. Human forces exhibit disorganized resistance patterns. Defensive fragmentation observed. Survival prioritization confirmed. Survival prioritization. The species was doing what every species does when threatened, trying to survive. Protecting population centers. Minimizing casualties. Making the rational calculations of a civilization that does not want to be removed from the universe and is doing what it can to prevent that outcome. Year 4. Behavioral deviation detected. I leaned forward. Human forces no longer optimizing for survival. The line sat on the screen in front of me, and I read it, and I read it again, and I read it a third time because I needed to make sure I was understanding it correctly. Not optimizing for survival. That was a specific, precise, technical phrase in the language of strategic analysis. It meant the behavioral models had registered a fundamental shift in what was being maximized. Every expansion of every civilization, every resistance, every war ever recorded, had survival as the ultimate optimization target. You could sacrifice resources, territory, individual units, but survival of the civilization was always what you were calculating toward. Year 4. Human forces no longer optimizing for survival. A note in the record, reclassification required. My hands had stopped moving. Year 5. Negotiation attempts initiated by Varadi Dominion. Of course, that's what you do when the thing you're fighting stops behaving the way things are supposed to behave. When the model breaks. When Year 4 happens and your prediction algorithms produce outputs that don't match observed reality, and you realize that you need more information before you can make good decisions. You try to talk. You try to establish communication. You try to understand what changed. Result: no response. Not rejection. A rejection would be a response. An angry refusal would be a response. A counter-demand, a condition, a statement of grievance. All of these would be responses. They would indicate that the other party was engaged in the negotiation, that they were participating in the same framework, that communication was possible even if agreement wasn't. No response. Nothing. Year 6. Secondary negotiation attempts. Improved terms offered. The Varadi had come back. With better terms. The willingness to give more. The recognition that the initial offer hadn't worked, and the logical next step was to improve what was on the table. Result: no response. The same nothing. Not because they hadn't heard. Not because communication had failed. Because no response was the answer. The silence was intentional. The silence was the message. And I understood, reading it in that cold room with the weight of 2 million years of civilizational history pressing down on every word, what that silence meant. What it had always meant. What it would always mean when humanity reached that particular point. That Year 4 point. That point past survival. The negotiations weren't refused. They were ignored. Because you don't negotiate with something you've decided to finish. Because negotiation requires you to care about the outcome. And what the silence communicated was that the outcome was already settled, and the only question was when. Year 7. Full military commitment authorized by Varadi High Council. Primary fleet mobilized and engaged. Everything they had. The full weight of 2 million years of accumulated military capability, deployed without reservation. The commitment you make when you understand that half measures have stopped being an option and you need to end this now. Decisively, finally. Year 8. Varadi Home System compromised. I stopped reading. Looked at that line for a long time. Home system. Compromised. Not the frontier. Not an outer territory. Not a military installation or a strategic resource. The home system. The heart of a 2 million year civilization. Compromised. A word that meant something had entered it that shouldn't have been able to. That defenses that had never been breached in 2 million years of civilizational history had been breached. That something had reached into the center of everything the Varadi were and changed the state of it. Year 1 through 3, they had been fighting a disorganized resistance. Year 8, their home system was compromised. For years. For years between Year 4, between the moment when humanity stopped trying to survive and started doing something else, and the moment the Varadi's oldest, most protected, most fortified place in the universe was breached. For years, year 9 through 11, progressive system loss. No recoverable communication. No tactical breakdown of those 3 years. No record of specific engagements, specific losses, specific decisions. Just progressive system loss. One after another. The infrastructure of a 2 million-year civilization disappearing. Going quiet. The way the relays had gone quiet earlier today, and I understood in my chest before I understood in my mind that those things were related, were the same shape of event just at different scales. No recoverable communication. The systems weren't sending distress signals by that point. They weren't asking for help or reporting what was happening to them. They simply stopped. Final status. No remaining variety signals detected. That was all. No aftermath. No assessment of causes. No analysis of strategic errors. No lessons learned document. Just the final line of a record that had run out of things to record. I sat there for a long time. They expected to win, I said. My voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere else. Yes, the archivist said. They were right to expect that. Yes. They had every advantage. Yes, the archivist said. Technology. Scale. Experience. Historical success with exactly this type of engagement. They were not wrong in their initial assessment of the situation. They were not wrong in their commitment. They were not wrong about anything until year 4, I said. Silence. Year 4, the archivist agreed. They stopped trying to survive, I said. I needed to say it out loud. Needed to hear how it sounded in the air of that cold room. They stopped counting their own dead, I said. They stopped optimizing for their own continuation. They became interested in something else. They became interested, the archivist said quietly, in the outcome. I looked at the screen, at the absence of explanation, at the record that documented without understanding, that captured the shape of what happened without being able to name what it was. Because what it was didn't fit into the analytical categories that a 2 million-year civilization had developed to describe conflict. It wasn't a strategy. It wasn't a doctrine. It wasn't something that could be countered because it wasn't a thing you countered. It was a state of being. A decision. The specific and terrible decision that a species makes, apparently, when it has been pushed past a certain point and turns from the question of its own survival to the question of the thing that threatened it. That is the point, the archivist said, at which every model fails. I understood it then, the full shape of it. Not just the variety. Not just the archive I was sitting in front of. The law. 15 years of that law existing in my peripheral awareness and me never looking at it directly. It wasn't a protection. Not for us. It was a warning. Written to every civilization in the known galaxy in the plainest possible language. Not for complexity, because complexity gets argued with, gets reinterpreted, gets revised by clever minds in future sessions. Plain language. Repeated 3 times. Absolute. You will not move against humanity. Because if you do, if you cross that line, if you make it a real war, if you push us past the point where we are concerned with our own survival and into the point where we have decided to end you, then what happens next is not a war. Not in any sense that any model in any archive can describe. It is something else. Something the Variety Dominion discovered at year 4 of an 11-year process that ended with the final line of their civilizational record. No remaining signals detected. You will not move against humanity, I said quietly, to the screen, to the empty archive around me, to no one in particular. Because once you do, you have already lost. The only question is when you will stop existing. The archivist said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be added. I felt fear then. Real fear. The kind that starts in the chest and spreads outward. Not for humanity. Not for what had been done to us. Not retrospective fear. Fear facing forward. Fear of what we were. Of what we became when pushed. Of the efficiency of it. The completeness. 11 years. No remaining signals. No drama. No monument to the conflict. No great final battle recorded in heroic detail. Just the wheel turning, and 11 years later, silence. And here we were. Again. The first relay had gone dark the night before. A quiet alert in a restricted feed. Signal interruption. Outer relay K-17. Clean stop. No degradation. No failure signature. Just absence where a signal had been. Something had reached out and turned it off. Like turning off a light. The second came 43 minutes later. Different sector, different system, no shared infrastructure. Same result. I plotted them. Directional. Moving. The third report came before I finished the thought. Relay M3, between the first two, closing the distance between absence and presence in a line that had a destination. And I thought about year 4. About the moment when the behavioral deviation was first detected. About the precise and terrible quality of a pattern that knew where it was going. The emergency session filled faster than I had ever seen the chamber fill. Every delegation, every seat. The upper galleries opened and filled with observers. The conclave's procedures for emergency assembly were efficient by necessity. When you governed 800 civilizations, you needed to be able to convene quickly when something required convening. The Varithi were already there. They weren't surprised. That was the first thing I noticed. They hadn't received information that nobody else had. The relay failures were being reported through standard channels that everyone monitored. But their lead representative was sitting in his position with an expression that wasn't the expression of someone receiving new and alarming information. It was the expression of someone watching a thing they had set in motion moving in the direction they had set it. Not gloating, not triumph. Something more complicated than that. Something that might have been, I thought, the first edge of understanding something they hadn't understood when they set it in motion. His hands were flat on the surface in front of him. Not relaxed. Anchored. Anomalous disruptions have been detected across 3 outer relay systems, the archivist said. Preliminary analysis confirms no internal failure. No environmental cause. No known external interference pattern. Lian leaned toward me. What does that mean? It means it's not the equipment, I said. Then what is it? Commander Ivers spoke, quiet and precise. Something is removing visibility. Systematically. 1 point at a time. The 4th report arrived while the archivist was still speaking. Relay H2. Added to the pattern that was becoming impossible to call anything other than a pattern. The Varithi representative stood. Are you suggesting these events are related to my procedural request? No, the archivist said. I am stating that your request was made at a time when similar events have occurred before. Correlation is not causation. No, the archivist agreed. It is not. But it is often the first indicator that causation is about to become visible. The 5th relay went dark before the session ended. Then the 6th, 12 hours later. The 7th within the same cycle. 3 more in rapid succession after that. The darkness spreading outward from the area of the Varithi Combine's outer holdings in a shape that wasn't a front, wasn't a siege line, wasn't anything you could call a conventional military formation. A perimeter. Something was drawing a border around a volume of space. Closing it. Pulling the walls in. They're not advancing, Hale said, staring at the projection. He was right. Nothing was moving toward anything. Nothing was attacking anything. The relay losses weren't the signature of a fleet sweeping through systems, destroying infrastructure. They were clean, quiet, one at a time, like someone turning off lights in rooms they have already decided to leave. They're closing, I said. Lian looked between us. Closing what? I thought about the answer for a moment. Thought about how to say it in a way that was honest without being something she couldn't process right now. Everything inside, I said. Commander Ivers understood. I saw it in his face. That's not how you fight a war, he said. No, I said. It's how you end one. The Varithi mobilized within 48 hours. Of course they did. A civilization built on rapid territorial integration had rapid military mobilization as a core institutional competency. Their first fleet, 300 vessels, the best they had, crewed by the best they had, equipped with weapons that had won them territory and respect across their expansion history, moved into the outer sectors with the confidence of a power that had never lost a conflict it committed to. I watched the deployment projections in the emergency session and felt nothing that could reasonably be called hope. They're engaging, Hale said. Yes, I said. Will that help? I thought about year 7 of the Varadi record. Full military commitment authorized. Primary fleet mobilized and engaged. It won't hurt them, I said carefully. The Varithi. It won't hurt them any more than not engaging would. Hale stared at me. They're committed now, I said. The engagement itself doesn't change the trajectory. It just fills the time between now and the end. The first reports from the outer sectors were fragmentary. Not unusual for contested space. Communication through conflict zones was always complicated, always compressed, always distorted by the specific electromagnetic consequences of whatever was happening in the vicinity of the communication. But the fragmentation pattern was wrong. Not interference. Not damage. The other end of the connection was simply not there anymore. 300 vessels. Gone. No retreat vectors. No warp signatures indicating emergency displacement. No debris field. No energy signatures consistent with weapons impact. No residual radiation suggesting the kind of destruction that leaves marks. Gone. Like the relays. The Varithi's second fleet deployed within the same cycle. This time with greater numbers, better tactical positioning, a more sophisticated formation designed for a threat they were beginning, I think, to suspect was not the kind of threat their tactical formation was designed for. The second fleet lasted longer. Long enough to send something back. A transmission. Fragmented, distorted, clearly recorded in conditions of extreme stress. Static. A voice. We can't. Cut. Static. They're not. Cut. Static. No central command. I leaned toward the terminal. They're everywhere. Gone. The room was silent for a long moment after the playback ended. What does that mean? Hale said. It means they're still looking for a front, I said. A line. A command structure. A center. Something you can target and strike and watch the rest follow. That's how every war they've ever won was won. Find the critical point, apply decisive force, let the body follow the head. There isn't a head, Ivers said. There's no center, I said. Every unit operating independently. No command structure to target because the decision isn't coming from a command structure. It came from everywhere at once. You can't cut off the head because the decision is in every part simultaneously. Lian looked at me. What decision? I met her eyes for a moment. That this ends. The third fleet didn't disappear quietly. It reported fragmentary transmissions over 3 days, describing something that none of the analytical frameworks had language for. Contacts that couldn't be located. Engagements that had no clear aggressor. The sensation, apparently, of fighting something that wasn't there until it was, and then wasn't there again. The transmission stopped on the 4th day. Not cut off. Not jammed. Simply ceased. The way a speaker ceases when they have nothing left to say. The 4th fleet never reported at all. The Varithi attempted adaptation. They were not stupid people. I want to be clear about that. They were a sophisticated, experienced, capable civilization that had built their history on exactly this kind of challenge and had met every previous version of it successfully. They consolidated their remaining forces, pulled back to defensible positions, tried to create geometry that would force engagement into a shape they could manage. It didn't matter, because the thing they were trying to defend against wasn't interested in their geometry, wasn't constrained by their formations, wasn't fighting them in any space where their defensive arrangements were relevant. Whatever was happening in the volumes of space where the Varithi had been was not a thing that could be positioned against, because it didn't have the kind of presence that positioning addresses. The 5th fleet disappeared. The 6th fleet disappeared. The outer systems that the Varithi had occupied, some for generations, some acquired more recently, went silent one by one. Not destroyed. Not burning. Not the aftermath of the kind of battle that leaves records. Aftermath. Something to analyze and learn from. Silent. Like a machine that has been turned off. I stood on the observation deck on the night the 7th fleet stopped reporting. Hands against the cold glass. Stars unchanged and unconcerned. They're afraid, Lian said quietly behind me. Yes. Of what we're doing. I thought about the archive. About the cold room. About 2 million years reduced to the phrase no remaining signals detected. About the way the wheel turned and what it produced when it turned. They're afraid, I said, of what we become when we decide to finish something. The last Varithi transmission arrived on day 19 of the conflict, if conflict was the right word for it. Short, structured, controlled in a way that, knowing what I knew now, I found heartbreaking in its discipline. All remaining forces, hold position, awaiting contact. No follow-up. No confirmation that contact ever came or that there was anyone left in a position to initiate it. The systems they had held went silent. And then, slowly, like lights coming on in a house after a long absence, human signals returned. Colony channels reactivating. Navigation beacons resuming. Civilian traffic picking up the rhythms of ordinary life with the ease of people who don't need to understand what happened in order to go back to their routines. A child on a colony station asking her mother when she was coming home. like something had passed through, and left everything that wasn't in its way exactly as it found it. The conclave recorded everything, every gap, every moment of absence, every signal that resumed, and every signal that didn't. When the analysis was complete, the classification they assigned to the Varithi Combine was one that had only appeared in the archives a handful of times in 400,000 years. Status: unresolved absence. Not extinct. They were too honest for that. They didn't know exactly what had happened, not in the specific details that would let you call it by a name that implied understanding. Only that the Varithi Combine had been present in a volume of space, and then was not, and that no evidence of the mechanism by which that transition occurred was detectable by any instrument the conclave possessed. Unresolved absence. Honest about the limits of the record. Honest about what it did and didn't know. The amendment session was witnessed by every delegation in the conclave's full membership. Not because attendance was required. It was not, for amendment sessions. They came because they needed to be there. Because some events require witness, and this was one of them. The chamber was the fullest I had ever seen it. The archivist stood at the center platform. The same position, the same posture, the same voice, but carrying something different, not heavier, exactly. More like something that had been in suspension had now settled into its final form. We convened to enter an amendment into the permanent record. Complete silence. The first law has remained unchanged for 390,000 years. A pause. That is no longer sufficient. Not a dramatic statement, a factual one, and the ripple that moved through the chamber was not surprise. It was the sound of 800 civilizations arriving simultaneously at the understanding that yes, what had just been demonstrated had changed what was required. The original text reads as follows. You will not move against humanity. Silence. You will not move against humanity. Stillness. You will not move against humanity. The words sounded different now, not abstract. Not procedural, proven. The way a theorem sounds different after you've seen its proof demonstrated in physical reality, in irreversible consequence, in the kind of evidence that can't be argued with because it simply is. The amended text is as follows. He paused. Not for effect. For weight. You will not move against humanity. A breath moved through the room. You will not move against humanity. You will not move against humanity. Then, further, should any civilization choose to disregard this law, the conclave is under no obligation to intervene. Absolute silence. The deepest silence I had ever heard in that chamber. This law does not exist to protect humanity. And every being in that room, 800 civilizations in their 800 different forms of attention and awareness and understanding, listened. It exists to protect you. The vote was unanimous. It took less than 30 seconds. I signed the record for the human delegation. My hand didn't shake. That surprised me. I thought it would shake. The archivist found me in the corridor after the chamber emptied. You understand now, he said. Yes, I said. I understand now. He studied me for a long moment. That is not always a comfort, he said. No, I said. It's really not. We stood in silence for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been building since the archive, since the cold room. Since the word extinct staring up at me from 400,000 years of careful, preserved memory. Are we the same? I said. As the Variety who ended them. Are we becoming that? Are we already that? He didn't answer immediately. And the not immediately was its own answer. In the way that things that aren't easy to answer communicate their difficulty before the words arrive. No, he said finally. The relief came sharp and brief. Not yet, he said. And just like that it was gone again. I stood on the observation deck alone. Much later, when the station had gone into its low-activity cycle and the corridors were quiet. Hands against the cold glass. Stars stretching in every direction, unchanged and indifferent. Somewhere out there, in systems that had been occupied and were now simply silent, the Varithi Combine had ceased to be something that could be located. 14 human colonies were going about their business. Parents putting children to bed. Engineers running diagnostics. Farmers checking harvest projections. The ordinary, unremarkable, profoundly human business of living. Resumed without ceremony or acknowledgement, because that is what you do when the immediate danger has passed and life reasserts its claim on your attention. I thought about the ease of it. That was the part that kept returning. Not the war. Not the scale. Not the way 3 fleets had disappeared without leaving residue. The ease. The efficiency, the way it had simply completed itself, like a process running to its natural end, like a wheel turning through its arc, and then people going back to their lives. I pulled out my terminal, opened a blank document. The cursor blinked in the dimness of the observation deck, patient and undemanding. Proposed second law. I stopped, sat with it. What law do you write to restrain something like this? What words hold a thing that doesn't experience restraint as restraint, that reads rules as information about the environment rather than as limits on action? The conclave had managed it for 400,000 years, through the original law's existence, through the particular weight of 800 civilizations choosing not to test what happened when the law was tested. That had worked, until someone decided to test it. And now it was in the record, cross-confirmed, consistent, available to every delegation that cared to look. I erased it, started again. We are not finished. Stared at that. It was true. It was the truest thing I could put in that document. Not finished becoming, not finished deciding, not fixed in whatever shape the archive described, not guaranteed to remain the thing the Verati encountered at year 4 and the Verithi encountered across 19 days and an unresolved absence. Not final, still in motion, still choosing. That could mean anything. The archivist had said not yet. I had to believe that those two words carried real meaning, that the gap between what we were and what we became when we stopped holding back was a gap we were capable of maintaining, that the wheel was something we could choose not to turn. But I had read the record. I had read year 4. I had understood what it meant when survival stops being the optimization target and something else takes its place. That something else wasn't random and it wasn't evil and it wasn't even, I thought, consciously chosen by any individual person on any of those 14 colonies who had simply been going about their lives while something larger than any of their individual decisions moved through the systems around them. It was just what we were, under certain conditions, past a certain point. Not yet meant the point hadn't been reached permanently. Not yet meant there was still a gap between who we were in ordinary life and what we became when that point was crossed. Not yet meant the distance was real. I needed to believe the distance was real. Outside the glass, the stars held their positions, arranged by physics into patterns that had nothing to do with the events that had unfolded between them. Indifferent, old beyond any reference point that felt meaningful, witness to everything and moved by nothing. Somewhere among them, the next test, the next civilization that would look at us and see something that seemed manageable, the next set of calculations that would produce a recommendation. Containment or elimination recommended. The next year 4. The next moment when something in us that is very old and very patient and very thorough would stop counting its own dead and start counting something else. Or not. Maybe not. Maybe not yet was permanent. Maybe the distance held. I saved the document without finishing it. Because I didn't know how to finish it. Because the ending I wanted to write. We will be different. We will choose differently. We will maintain the distance. Felt like a promise I didn't have the authority to make on behalf of 14 colonies and every human being who would come after them. And the ending the record suggested didn't have words. Only absence. I turned away from the glass. There was work to do. Reports to write. Protocols to review and update. A conclave that would spend the next months and years processing what had happened and what it meant for the governance of 800 civilizations that now had new information about the species that sat among them in chairs that were never quite the right size. The cursor was still blinking when I put the terminal away. We are not finished. Patient. Waiting. I don't know if those words are a warning or a promise. I have been thinking about it since I wrote them, and I still don't know. Maybe they are both. Maybe for a species like ours they have always been both. The same truth pointing in two directions at once, toward everything we might become and everything we might do, toward the best of what choosing means and the worst of what not choosing means. Maybe that is the most accurate thing that has ever been written about us. Not what we did, not what was done to us, what we would do next, what we are always, in every moment, on the verge of doing next. And whether this time, unlike the Verati, unlike whatever came before the Verati, unlike whatever the archive recorded in those consistent, cross-confirmed accounts that the archivist called cautionary rather than instructional. Whether this time, we would find that the distance holds, and choose to stay on the right side of it. The stars watched. They would keep watching, long after whatever happened next had happened and been recorded and filed in the cold and the silence and the patient rows of things that needed to survive. They had watched before. They would watch again. And somewhere in the dark between them, the wheel continued to turn, slowly, quietly, with the particular patience of something that already knows every revolution ends in the same place. I just didn't know yet which revolution this was. And I was afraid, in the quiet of the observation deck with the stars for company and the cursor still blinking in the document I hadn't finished, I was afraid that by the time I knew, it would already be too late to matter.